I should have known better than to try a dating app. I never really trusted them. The idea of swiping through profiles, each one more polished than the last, felt more like shopping than dating. But after one too many nights alone, I gave in. My friends insisted it was the modern way to meet people, so I downloaded one of the popular ones, set up my profile, and began swiping. His name was Alex. He wasn't the kind of guy I usually went for, but something about his profile caught my attention. His bio was short and sweet. Love hiking, traveling, and trying new things, looking for someone who can make me laugh. His pictures showed him outdoors, smiling, and with a golden retriever that looked like it could melt anyone's heart. He wasn't overly muscular or trying too hard, which I liked. He looked genuine, approachable. We matched within minutes, and my phone buzzed with a message from him almost immediately. I wasn't expecting that. Usually I'd be the one waiting for days, wondering if the guy was ever going to message me. But not Alex. "Hey Sarah, nice to meet you. You seem pretty adventurous. Do you like hiking too?" That was all it took. Simple, no weird pickup lines. We started chatting, and our conversation flowed effortlessly. It felt like we'd known each other for years. He was funny, charming, and from what I could tell, genuinely interested in getting to know me. After a few days of texting back and forth, we decided to meet up. That's when things started to feel off. We agreed to meet at a small cafe downtown, one of my favorites. It was quiet, cozy, and had the best coffee in the city. The day we were supposed to meet, he messaged me early in the morning to confirm, but something in his tone was different. He sounded distant. His replies were shorter than usual, and when I tried to make a joke, he didn't respond at all. "Are you okay?" I typed, suddenly feeling a little weird about the whole thing. A few minutes later, his response popped up. "Yeah, just tired. Long night." I shrugged it off, thinking maybe he was just having a bad day, and tried not to overthink it. Maybe he was nervous. First dates can be stressful. At 6 p.m., I arrived at the cafe and sat at a table near the window. I texted Alex to let him know I was there. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I kept looking at the door, expecting him to walk in at any moment, but nothing. He wasn't responding to my messages now either. I waited for almost an hour, feeling embarrassed and frustrated. Had I been stood up? I couldn't believe it. Just as I was about to give up and leave, my phone buzzed. "Sorry, running late. Be there in 5. Annoyed, but still hopeful, I decided to wait. 5 minutes turned into 10, then 15. I sent a final message. "Hey, if you're not coming, just tell me. I'll leave." No response. I paid for my coffee and walked out, feeling both angry and stupid. I couldn't believe I had been ghosted like that. It wasn't just that he hadn't shown up, it was how strange he had acted the entire day. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had been creeping up on me all afternoon. I blocked his number and deleted the app. That night I tossed and turned in bed, replaying everything in my head. Something about it didn't sit right. Sure, people get stood up on dating apps all the time, but this didn't feel like that. It felt like something more deliberate. Around 2 a.m., just as I was finally drifting off to sleep, my phone buzzed. I ignored it at first, assuming it was some random spam email or late-night notification. But then it buzzed again, and again. Groaning, I rolled over and grabbed my phone. It was a text from an unknown number. "Why did you leave?" My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the screen, wide-eyed, reading the message over and over. It couldn't be Alex. I had blocked him. Before I could even process what was happening, another message came through. "You shouldn't have left. I was there." My breath caught in my throat. He was there? Watching me? I quickly typed back, my hands shaking. "Who is this?" 3 little dots appeared, indicating he was typing. I held my breath, waiting for his reply. "You know who it is." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. This wasn't just someone ghosting me on a dating app. This was someone who had been watching me the entire time, someone who knew where I was. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? "Hey, I met a guy on a dating app and now he's texting me creepy stuff." They'd probably tell me to change my number and move on, so that's what I did. I blocked the unknown number and tried to go back to sleep, though it felt like my skin was crawling for the rest of the night. A few minutes later, his response popped up. "Yeah, just tired, long night." I shrugged it off, thinking maybe he was just having a bad day, and tried not to overthink it. Maybe he was nervous. First dates can be stressful. At 6 p.m., I arrived at the cafe and sat at a table near the window. I texted Alex to let him know I was there. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I kept looking at the door, expecting him to walk in at any moment, but nothing. He wasn't responding to my messages now either. I waited for almost an hour, feeling embarrassed and frustrated. Had I been stood up? I couldn't believe it. Just as I was about to give up and leave, my phone buzzed. "Sorry, running late. Be there in 5. Annoyed but still hopeful, I decided to wait. 5 minutes turned into 10, then 15. I sent a final message. "Hey, if you're not coming, just tell me. I'll leave." No response. I paid for my coffee and walked out, feeling both angry and stupid. I couldn't believe I had been ghosted like that. It wasn't just that he hadn't shown up. It was how strange he had acted the entire day. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had been creeping up on me all afternoon. I blocked his number and deleted the app. That night I tossed and turned in bed, replaying everything in my head. Something about it didn't sit right. Sure, people get stood up on dating apps all the time, but this didn't feel like that. It felt like something more deliberate. Around 2 a.m., just as I was finally drifting off to sleep, my phone buzzed. I ignored it at first, assuming it was some random spam email or late-night notification. But then it buzzed again and again. Groaning, I rolled over and grabbed my phone. It was a text from an unknown number. "Why did you leave?" My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the screen, wide-eyed, reading the message over and over. It couldn't be Alex. I had blocked him. Before I could even process what was happening, another message came through. "You shouldn't have left." I was there. My breath caught in my throat. He was there? Watching me? I quickly typed back, my hands shaking. "Who is this?" 3 little dots appeared, indicating he was typing. I held my breath, waiting for his reply. "You know who it is." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. This wasn't just someone ghosting me on a dating app, this was someone who had been watching me the entire time, someone who knew where I was. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? "Hey, I met a guy on a dating app and now he's texting me creepy stuff?" They'd probably tell me to change my number and move on. So that's what I did. I blocked the unknown number and tried to go back to sleep, though it felt like my skin was crawling for the rest of the night. The next few days were uneventful, but I couldn't shake the paranoia that followed me everywhere. I kept checking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would race, but thankfully it was just regular notifications. Until one night, about a week later. I was in bed trying to fall asleep when I heard it. A soft tap at my bedroom window. At first I thought I was imagining things. I lived on the second floor of a small apartment complex. No one could possibly be outside my window. But then I heard it again. Tap. Tap. I froze. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe a tree branch was brushing against the glass. But no, there were no trees near my window. I slowly sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The tapping continued, soft but insistent, like someone was trying to get my attention without making too much noise. I didn't want to look. I knew deep down that whatever or whoever was outside that window wasn't supposed to be there. But something compelled me to move. I slid out of bed and crept toward the window, my body shaking with fear. I reached out and grabbed the curtain, pulling it aside just enough to peek through the glass. And there he was. Alex. Standing outside my window on the narrow ledge, staring at me with a blank expression. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were wide, unblinking. His clothes were soaked through, like he had been standing out in the rain for hours. But there had been no rain. I stumbled back, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream. How was he standing there? How did he even know where I lived? Before I could react, my phone buzzed from across the room. I glanced at it, terrified of what I would see. A message from an unknown number. "Let me in." I ran. I didn't even think about grabbing anything. My keys, my wallet, nothing. I bolted out of my bedroom, down the hallway, and out the front door of my apartment. I could still feel his eyes on me burning into the back of my head as I fled down the stairs and into the street. I didn't stop running until I reached the gas station a few blocks away. I burst through the door, gasping for breath, tears streaming down my face. The clerk gave me a concerned look, but I couldn't even form the words to explain what had just happened. I didn't go back to my apartment that night. I called a friend, and they let me crash on their couch while I tried to figure out what to do next. The police took my statement the next day, but there wasn't much they could do. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been outside my window. They suggested it might have been a prank or someone playing a sick joke, but I knew the truth. Alex was real, and he was still out there. I changed my number, moved to a new apartment across town, and deleted every dating app from my phone. For months I lived in fear, jumping at every little sound, expecting to see his face in every crowd. Eventually, the paranoia started to fade, and I began to feel like myself again. But then, one night, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was from an unknown number. "I found you." I was never someone who believed in love at first sight, especially not on a dating app. But after my last breakup, I decided to give it a shot. I downloaded the usual apps and began the tedious process of swiping through profiles. I wasn't in a rush. I figured I'd take my time, get to know a few people, maybe go on a date or two. But then I came across Ethan. Ethan's profile immediately stood out to me. His bio was almost eerily in line with everything I looked for in a partner. Music lover, history nerd, and horror movie fanatic. Looking for someone who can enjoy a quiet night in as much as a spontaneous adventure. I couldn't believe it. It felt like I had written it myself. The pictures weren't bad either. Tall, dark-haired, with soft eyes that seemed kind. His smile wasn't perfect, it was just a little crooked, but in a way that made him seem approachable. Real. I swiped right without a second thought, and within minutes we matched. My heart did a little flutter, but I tried to keep my expectations in check. You never know who people really are behind the carefully curated photos and bios. He messaged first. "Hey Sarah, looks like we're into the same kind of stuff. Ever been to that new record store downtown?" I had. In fact, it was one of my favorite spots. We bonded over our love for vinyl records, the way music sounds so much better when it's played on a turntable. From there, the conversation flowed naturally. It wasn't forced, no awkward pauses or weird comments. We moved on to talking about movies, how we both loved those old black and white horror films, the ones that relied more on atmosphere than jump scares. After about a week of talking, Ethan suggested we meet in person. Normally, I'd feel nervous about meeting someone from an app, but with him it felt easy, like I already knew him. We decided on a casual date. Coffee at a cafe not far from where I lived. It was in a busy area, and I felt safe. On the day of the date, I arrived early. I always do that, just to get a feel for the place and calm my nerves. I texted him when I sat down, letting him know I was there. He replied almost immediately, saying he was on his way and would be there in a few minutes. I sipped my coffee, watching the door every time it opened, my stomach flipping with every new customer that walked in. Finally, Ethan arrived. He looked just like his pictures, maybe even better in person. He had that same warm, crooked smile. When he saw me, his face lit up, and he walked over to the table with an easy, confident stride. "Sarah?" he asked, though he already knew it was me. "Ethan?" I replied with a smile, standing up to shake his hand. But instead of shaking it, he pulled me into a gentle hug. It wasn't creepy, just familiar, like he was someone I'd known for a long time. We sat down, and the conversation flowed even better in person than it had over text. We talked about music, movies, and weirdly, history. I mentioned I'd always wanted to visit old historic places, and he said he'd been to a bunch. He even knew a lot about local urban legends, which piqued my curiosity. He had this way of making even the most mundane topics seem interesting. But then, halfway through the date, something shifted. We were talking about travel, and I mentioned a trip I'd taken a few years ago with friends. I hadn't told Ethan about it before, so I figured I'd get his usual enthusiasm, but instead he cut me off. "You didn't like that trip," he said casually, stirring his coffee. I froze for a moment, unsure of how to respond. No, it was fun. We went hiking and—" "No," he interrupted again, his eyes locking onto mine. "You hated it, remember? You told me." I felt a strange knot form in my stomach. I definitely hadn't told him that. In fact, I hadn't said anything negative about the trip at all. I laughed awkwardly, trying to brush it off. I mean, sure, there were some tough moments, but— "Sarah," he said, leaning forward slightly, his expression growing more serious. "I know you didn't like it. You don't have to pretend." I felt a shiver creep up my spine. Why was he so certain? I hadn't given him any reason to think that. I changed the subject, trying to shake off the weirdness, but the rest of the date felt slightly off. Ethan was still friendly and charming, but there were small moments, things he said or the way he looked at me, that made me feel like he knew too much about me, things I hadn't told him. We finished our coffee, and he offered to walk me home. I declined politely, suddenly feeling uneasy about spending more time with him. He looked disappointed but didn't press the issue. He gave me that same warm smile and said, "I'll text you." When I got home, I tried to shake off the weird feeling, telling myself I was overreacting. Maybe he just guessed about the trip or picked up on something I'd said earlier. But as the evening went on, my unease grew. I opened the app to check Ethan's profile again, but when I went to our chat history, I noticed something strange. The messages we had exchanged, everything we'd talked about for the past week, were gone. Confused, I scrolled through the app, trying to find his profile. But it wasn't there. It was like he'd vanished. Maybe he deleted his account, I thought. But the missing messages didn't make sense. Even if someone deleted their account, the conversation usually remained in the app's inbox. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the date in my mind, the way he'd spoken so confidently about things he shouldn't have known. And then, around 2 a.m., I received a text from an unknown number. It was Ethan. "Had a great time tonight. See you soon." There was no way. If he deleted his account, how did he get my number? I hadn't given it to him. The app didn't show phone numbers unless you exchanged them, which we hadn't. I didn't respond. The next day, I decided to block the number. It all felt too strange. But when I went to block it, another text came through. "Why aren't you answering?" A wave of cold fear washed over me. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. How had this guy gotten so close, so fast? I didn't respond again, and a few minutes later, a third message arrived. "I know where you live." I dropped my phone, my heart racing. How could he possibly know where I lived? I hadn't given him my address, hadn't mentioned anything specific about my apartment. I grabbed my phone and, with shaking hands, blocked the number. But the fear didn't go away. In fact, it only grew worse. That night I barely slept. Every creak of my apartment sent me into a panic. I kept glancing at my windows, expecting to see someone standing outside. I even thought about calling the police, but what would I say? He hadn't done anything illegal, just creepy, really creepy. The next few days were quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I left my apartment, I felt like someone was following me. I began avoiding places I usually went, taking different routes to work, but the unease lingered. Then, one evening, as I was coming home from work, I noticed something that sent my heart plummeting. Stuck under my front door was a small handwritten note. "I told you I'd see you soon." I ran inside, locked every door and window, and called the police. When they arrived, they searched the area, but of course they found nothing. I told them everything, about Ethan, the text, the note, but they said there wasn't much they could do unless he had physically harmed me. They advised me to stay vigilant and call if anything else happened. That night I packed a bag and stayed with a friend. I never saw Ethan again after that. The text stopped, the feeling of being followed eventually faded, but the memory of that date, The way he looked at me, like he knew everything about me, has haunted me ever since. Now, every time I see a new match pop up on a dating app, I hesitate. Because sometimes the perfect match isn't so perfect after all. It all started as an impulsive decision. I had been working non-stop for months, buried under deadlines and dealing with a breakup that left me emotionally drained. So when my best friend Emily suggested I take a solo trip abroad to clear my head, I didn't even hesitate. I booked a flight to Spain, rented a charming little apartment in Barcelona for 2 weeks, and told myself I'd live like a local, far away from the pressures of work and the messiness of my life back home. The first few days were incredible. Barcelona was everything I needed, vibrant, full of life, and so different from the gray routine I had left behind. I spent my days wandering through the Gothic quarter, marveling at Gaudi's architecture and lounging on the beach with a cold drink in hand. I hadn't felt this relaxed in months, but as I wandered through the streets one afternoon, I realized something. Despite the beauty and excitement around me, I was lonely. I had come all this way to escape, to find something new, but instead I felt like I was floating through the city with no real connection to anyone. And so one night, after a glass of wine too many, I decided to download a dating app just to meet people, I told myself. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision, but I figured, why not? I wasn't looking for anything serious, just someone to share a drink with or maybe show me around the city. After all, what's the harm in a little holiday romance? Within minutes of setting up my profile, I started getting matches. Most were the usual, guys just looking for a fling, messaging in broken English with pickup lines that made me roll my eyes. But then I matched with Mateo. Mateo's profile caught my attention immediately. He was local, born and raised in Barcelona, and his pictures were stunning. Dark, wavy hair that framed a chiseled jawline, sun-kissed skin and piercing green eyes that seemed to look right through the camera. He had that effortless Mediterranean charm that made me feel giddy just swiping through his photos. His bio was short but intriguing. Looking for adventure and someone who appreciates the beauty of this city. He messaged me first. "Hola, Sarah. You seem like you could use a local guide. Have you seen the real Barcelona yet?" I laughed at the message, already liking the playful confidence. We started chatting, and unlike most of the other guys, Mateo wasn't just after a quick hookup. He asked me about my trip, what I'd seen so far, and whether I wanted to experience some of the lesser-known parts of the city. His English was perfect, and his humor and wit made it easy to talk to him. After a couple of days of back and forth, Mateo suggested we meet up. He promised to take me to a part of Barcelona tourists rarely see, an old village just outside the city that had been abandoned for decades. I hesitated for a moment. Meeting a stranger in a foreign country and going somewhere off the beaten path? It sounded risky. But the adventurer in me was curious, and honestly, Mateo seemed charming enough to make me forget my better judgment. We agreed to meet in a small cafe near my apartment before heading to the village. The day of the date, I felt a mix of excitement and nerves. I dressed casually, telling myself it wasn't a big deal, but I couldn't shake the flutter of anticipation in my stomach. When I arrived at the cafe, Mateo was already there, sitting at an outdoor table, sipping a coffee. He looked even better in person. Taller than I had imagined, with that easy smile that made me feel instantly at ease. He stood up when he saw me, greeting me with a kiss on each cheek, the way the locals do. I felt my face flush, a little giddy from the gesture. "You're even more beautiful in person," he said smoothly, his green eyes twinkling as he pulled out a chair for me. We chatted over coffee for a while, and any lingering doubts I had about meeting him quickly melted away. Mateo was charismatic, intelligent, and funny in a way that felt genuine. He told me stories about growing up in Barcelona, about how the city had changed over the years and how most tourists only ever scratched the surface of what it had to offer. After about an hour, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Ready to see something special?" "Let's do it," I said, feeling a surge of excitement. This was what I had come here for. An adventure, something different, something real. We hopped on his motorbike, and as we sped through the winding streets of Barcelona, I felt a thrill of freedom I hadn't felt in years. The wind rushed through my hair, the city lights flickering past us as we headed away from the bustling center toward the outskirts of the city. It didn't take long to reach the village. Mateo parked the bike at the edge of a narrow dirt road and we walked the rest of the way. As we approached, I noticed the eerie silence. The buildings were old, crumbling, and overgrown with ivy. There was something hauntingly beautiful about the place, like it had been forgotten by time. "Not many people know about this place," Mateo said as we walked down the deserted main street. "It was abandoned decades ago. Some say it's haunted." I laughed, thinking he was just trying to spook me. But there was a seriousness in his voice that made me pause. "Haunted," I echoed, raising an eyebrow. He shrugged. "It's just an old legend. People disappeared from here without a trace back in the 1950s. No one knows why, but after that, the village was abandoned. Locals avoid it." As we wandered through the empty streets, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that crept up my spine. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ground, and the air felt cooler here, heavier. I glanced at Mateo, who seemed completely at ease, strolling through the village like it was his backyard. "You're not scared of this place?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. He smiled but didn't answer right away. Instead, he led me to the edge of the village, where an old church stood, its doors hanging off their hinges. "Come on," he said, motioning for me to follow him inside. I hesitated. Something about the church gave me a bad feeling, like we weren't supposed to be there. But Mateo's smile was reassuring, and I didn't want to seem like a coward. So I followed him in. The inside of the church was dark, the air thick with dust. Broken pews were scattered across the floor, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the air. I shivered, hugging my arms to my chest. "This place is incredible," Mateo said, his voice echoing through the empty hall. "It's like stepping back in time." I forced a smile, but my unease was growing by the second. The silence felt oppressive, like the air itself was watching us. I glanced around, my eyes adjusting to the dim light, and that's when I saw it. A flicker of movement in the corner of the room. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Mateo turned to me, his expression unreadable. "See what?" I thought I saw something," I stammered, my eyes darting back to the corner. But there was nothing there now, just shadows. Mateo's smile didn't reach his eyes. "It's just your imagination. This place has that effect on people." I nodded, but the uneasy feeling only grew stronger. I glanced at my phone, suddenly aware of how late it was getting. The sun had set completely now, and the village was cloaked in darkness. "We should probably head back," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's getting late." Mateo's smile faltered for a moment, but then he nodded. "Of course, let's go." We left the church, and as we made our way back through the village, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every sound, every creak of the old buildings made me jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced that something, or someone, was following us. When we finally reached the motorbike, I let out a sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. As Mateo started the engine, I noticed something strange. The village, which had been completely dark a moment ago, was now bathed in a faint, flickering light. I turned to look and my blood ran cold. The lights in the old buildings were on. All of them. "Mateo," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Look." He didn't turn around, he just stared ahead, his face expressionless. "Don't look back," he said quietly, his voice devoid of the warmth it had carried earlier. "Get on the bike." I hesitated for a moment, but the urgency in his voice sent a spike of fear through me. I climbed onto the bike, wrapping my arms tightly around him, and we sped off into the night. As we drove away, I couldn't resist glancing back one last time, and what I saw made my heart stop. Figures. Dark, shadowy figures were standing in the windows of the abandoned buildings, watching us leave. We didn't speak on the ride back to the city. The silence between us was heavy, tense, and by the time we reached my apartment, I was trembling. Mateo parked the bike and turned to me, his face unreadable. "Sarah," he said softly, "you'll be safe now. Just don't go back there. Ever." I didn't ask him what he meant. I didn't want to know. I just nodded, thanked him for the evening, and hurried inside my building, locking the door behind me. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadowy figures standing in the windows watching me. The next morning, I deleted the dating app and blocked Mateo's number. I never saw him again. But sometimes when I'm alone at night, I think about that village, about the way the lights flickered on in the dark, and about the figures watching us leave. And I wonder if they're still there, waiting for someone else to wander into their forgotten world. I've never been great at dating, if I'm being honest. I'm more of a homebody, someone who prefers Netflix and takeout over bars and clubs. After years of failed relationships, I swore off dating for a while. But of course, like everyone else, I eventually got bored of being single. That's when I gave in to the dating apps. I don't know why I thought it would be different this time. Maybe it was because all my friends were pairing off, or maybe I just wanted someone to make life feel a little less predictable. Either way, I downloaded the app, set up my profile, and started swiping. It was the usual mix of profiles. Guys trying too hard, awkward small talk, and dates that fizzled out before they even began. But then I matched with Mark. He wasn't exactly the type I usually went for. His photos showed him with dark, brooding eyes and a strong jawline, not smiling like most of the other guys. There was something intense about him, something that drew me in. His bio was simple: looking for something real, tired of the games. There was no fluff, no pretense, and I found that refreshing. We started messaging, and unlike most conversations that felt forced, talking to Mark was easy. His responses were thoughtful, a bit mysterious even, but I liked that. He seemed mature, confident, and most of all, genuine. After about a week of texting, Mark suggested we meet up. He didn't push or pressure me, he just asked in a way that made it feel casual and low stakes. "There's this small Italian restaurant on the edge of town," he said. "Quiet, great food, no crowd. How about we meet there?" I agreed, feeling more comfortable with him than I had with anyone in a long time. The idea of a quiet dinner sounded perfect. No loud bars, no awkward group settings, just us, good food, and conversation. The day of the date I felt nervous, but in a good way. I hadn't been on a real date in months, and something about Mark made me excited. I arrived at the restaurant early, wanting to get a feel for the place before he showed up. It was charming, just like he described. Small, with dim lighting and cozy booths. The kind of place you'd never notice if you weren't looking for it. I texted him when I got there. "I'm here, just grabbed a table, no rush." He responded almost immediately. "Great, be there in 5. I sat back, sipping the glass of wine I had ordered, and waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I checked my phone again, but no new messages. It wasn't like him to be late. I figured maybe he was stuck in traffic or parking, so I tried not to worry. But as the minutes ticked by, the knot in my stomach grew tighter. Something felt off. 20 minutes had passed now, and I hadn't heard from him. I texted again, "Hey, everything okay?" No response. I stared at the screen, growing more anxious by the second. This wasn't like Mark. He had always been responsive, never leaving me hanging like this. I told myself not to panic, but the pit in my stomach was gnawing at me. Was I being stood up? Ghosted? After all the genuine conversations we had shared, I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Just as I was about to text him one last time, my phone buzzed. "Sorry, I'm running a bit late, almost there." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Relieved, I texted back, "No worries, see you soon." Another 10 minutes went by, then 15. The waiter had come by 3 times to ask if I was ready to order, and I kept brushing him off, embarrassed. I glanced at the door every time it opened, but it was never him. I checked my phone again. No new messages. I texted him, "Are you sure you're coming? Should I wait?" No response. The knot in my stomach returned tighter this time. Something wasn't right. I decided to give him 5 more minutes, and if he didn't show up, I was leaving. I stared at the clock on my phone, watching the seconds tick by. Then, as if on cue, my phone buzzed. "Outside, meet me." I frowned. Outside? Why would he ask me to meet him outside? The restaurant was small, and there was no reason he couldn't just walk in. Maybe he had trouble finding parking or something, I reasoned. Trying to shake off the uneasy feeling, I grabbed my bag and headed for the door. As soon as I stepped outside, the cool night air hit me. I looked around, scanning the street for any sign of him. The area was quiet, no cars passing by, no people walking. Just the dim glow of streetlights and the distant hum of the city. I checked my phone again. I'm right around the corner. Come find me. A chill ran down my spine. Why wouldn't he just come to the front of the restaurant? I stood there for a moment, trying to decide what to do. Every instinct in me screamed that something was wrong, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. Maybe he was just being playful, trying to make the date a little more interesting. Against my better judgment, I followed the directions. I turned the corner and walked down the narrow side street behind the restaurant. It was darker here, the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. This didn't feel right. I stopped walking. My heart was pounding in my chest now, my palms clammy. I checked my phone again, my hands shaking slightly. Just a little further, you're almost here. I stared at the message, every fiber of my being telling me to turn around and leave. Something was very wrong. I looked up, scanning the empty street. There was no one here, no sign of Mark, no cars, nothing but silence. I took a deep breath and texted him, "Where are you?" I waited, staring at the screen. The 3 little dots appeared, showing he was typing. My heart raced as I waited for his response. And then it came. Right behind you. I froze. Cold fear shot through my entire body. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Slowly, with shaking hands, I typed back, "Stop messing with me. Where are you?" I hit send and stood there, too afraid to move. The 3 dots appeared again. "Turn around, Sarah." My breath caught in my throat. My fingers hovered over my phone, trying to decide what to do. I couldn't bring myself to turn around. The street was completely still, but I felt eyes on me, watching. My mind raced with 1,000 possibilities, each one worse than the last. And then, out of the silence, I heard it. A soft, deliberate footstep behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but there was no one there. The street was empty. I stood there, breathing heavily, scanning the shadows for any movement. Nothing, just the wind rustling through the trees. I didn't wait for another message. I bolted. I ran back to the restaurant, my legs moving faster than I thought possible, my breath ragged and desperate. When I reached the front door, I practically fell inside, the warm lights and sounds of people talking inside the restaurant hitting me like a wave of safety. I found my table and sank into the chair, my entire body trembling. I stared at my phone, waiting for something, anything, to explain what had just happened. But there was nothing. No new messages, no missed calls, just silence. I sat there for what felt like hours, waiting for my heartbeat to slow down. Finally, I gathered the courage to check the app again to see if I could find his profile, to make sense of this nightmare. But when I opened the app, Mark's profile was gone. Vanished, as if it had never existed. Our entire chat history had disappeared too, like he had never been there in the first place. I left the restaurant, my heart still pounding, and walked home, looking over my shoulder every few minutes, convinced that someone was following me. I deleted the app as soon as I got back to my apartment and blocked the number he had used to text me. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I'd catch glimpses of someone standing too close behind me in the grocery store, or see a shadowy figure out of the corner of my eye when I was walking home. But every time I turned around, there was no one there. And then, the texts started again. "Miss me?" I never responded, but the messages kept coming, one every few days, always from a new number, always asking the same thing. "Turn around." I never did. It was one of those dreary, rainy Sundays where the only thing that made sense was to stay in bed, wrapped up in blankets, and scroll mindlessly on my phone. I had been single for over a year now, and even though I told myself I was content with it, the loneliness started creeping in on days like this. So I did what I usually did when I was bored and a little lonely. I opened up one of the dating apps I had been swiping on for months, with no real intention of meeting anyone. Swipe left, swipe right. Wait, was that? No, it couldn't be. I paused, blinking at the screen. The face staring back at me seemed impossible. A familiar set of deep brown eyes, a jawline that hadn't changed since high school, and a smile that I had seen 1,000 times before. Jake Miller. Jake. My ex-best friend from college. Well, I suppose best friend wasn't quite accurate anymore. We had drifted apart after college, the way people do when life takes them in different directions. But seeing his face here after so many years was like being punched in the gut by nostalgia. I hadn't thought about Jake in a long time, at least not consciously. But now, memories started flooding back. Long nights spent studying together, late-night food runs, the inside jokes that no one else ever seemed to get, the way we always had each other's backs. He was the first person I'd text when something great happened and the one I'd lean on when life got rough. We had been inseparable. Then, after graduation, it all fell apart. I hadn't seen him since the last time we spoke, which, if I was honest, didn't end well. I still remember the argument, one of those drunken fights that start as nothing and somehow become everything. Words were said that couldn't be unsaid. There was anger, frustration, and a lot of unspoken feelings that I think neither of us were mature enough to deal with back then. He had moved away for a job, and I stayed in the city. And just like that, 5 years passed with nothing but the occasional happy birthday message on Facebook. I stared at his picture for what felt like forever. It felt surreal to see him on a dating app of all places. Part of me wanted to swipe left and avoid opening that can of worms, but curiosity got the better of me. I swiped right. It's a match. My stomach flipped. Of course it was. The universe had a way of throwing curveballs when you least expected it. I set my phone down, not sure what to do. What were the odds that we'd both be single, both on this app and both in the same city after all this time? I wasn't even sure if I wanted to talk to him. So much had happened, so much time had passed. But before I could overthink it any further, my phone buzzed with a message. Jake. Well, this is unexpected. I stared at the message, chewing on my lip. A million responses raced through my mind, but I didn't want to seem too eager. So I settled on something casual. Me. You're telling me. Small world, huh? He replied almost instantly. Jake. Small city, too. What are the chances we'd both end up on here? I laughed softly, despite myself. It was such a Jake thing to say, his ability to turn anything into a joke, even something as bizarre as this. I could almost hear his voice, that sarcastic tone he always used when he was trying to lighten the mood. The conversation flowed surprisingly easily after that. It was as if no time had passed at all. We started with the usual "how have you been" questions, cautiously tiptoeing around the past. He told me he had moved back to the city about a year ago after spending a few years working abroad. We didn't get into too many details right away, but it felt comfortable, familiar. After a few days of messaging, Jake suggested we grab coffee. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if it was a good idea. Part of me wondered if meeting in person would reopen old wounds, but the other part of me was curious. And if I was being honest with myself, I missed him. Despite everything that had happened, I missed having him in my life. I agreed. We decided to meet at a small cafe downtown, one that neither of us had ever been to. I thought it would be better to choose a neutral place, somewhere without any history attached to it. As I walked in, I spotted him immediately. He hadn't changed much. His hair was a little shorter and he had a bit of scruff on his face, but he still had that same easy smile. My heart did a strange little flip as I walked over to the table. Jake stood up when he saw me, his expression a mix of surprise and something else. Something warmer, softer. We hugged, and for a brief moment, I felt like I was stepping back in time, like we were those college kids again before everything got complicated. So, he said as we sat down, "How have you been? Really?" I laughed, shaking my head. "We already went over this in the app, remember?" "Yeah, but that's the dating app version of us," he said with a smirk. "I want the real answer." I smiled. That was one thing I had always liked about Jake. He had this way of cutting through the small talk. getting straight to the heart of things. It made him feel genuine. Honestly, I've been better, I admitted. Life's been a little messy lately. What about you? Same, he said, his smile fading slightly. I've been figuring things out. Took me longer than I thought it would. We sat in silence for a moment, sipping our coffees. It was strange, being here with him after so long. The awkwardness of first dates wasn't there, but in its place was the weight of our shared history, the unspoken things that still lingered between us. I've thought about you, he said suddenly, catching me off guard. I looked up from my cup, meeting his gaze. Over the years, I mean. I always wondered what you were up to, if you were happy. I thought about you too, I admitted, feeling my cheeks flush. I wanted to reach out a few times, but I don't know. I guess I didn't know how. Jake nodded, running a hand through his hair. Yeah, me too. After what happened, I wasn't sure if you even wanted to hear from me. The what happened was, of course, that fight, the one that had ended our friendship. We had never really talked about it afterward. It was one of those things we both just let simmer until we drifted apart. I hated how things ended between us, I said quietly, staring down at my coffee. I wish we had handled it better. So do I, he said softly. I was an idiot back then. I didn't know how to deal with, well, anything, really. I looked up at him, and for the first time in years, I saw the vulnerability in his eyes. The mask of confidence he had always worn was gone, and in its place was someone who, like me, had been hurt, had grown, and was maybe still figuring things out. We talked more after that, about the fight, about how immature we had both been, and about how much we had changed. It felt cathartic in a way to finally address the elephant in the room. I hadn't realized how much I had been holding on to that hurt until now. As the conversation shifted to lighter topics, I found myself laughing again, genuinely enjoying his company. It felt so easy, so natural, like we were falling back into the rhythm we had once had. And yet, there was something different, something that hadn't been there before. By the time we finished our coffees, it was dark outside and the cafe was starting to empty. Neither of us made a move to leave. There was a tension between us, a kind of electricity I hadn't felt in years. So, Jake said, leaning back in his chair with a playful grin. What's the verdict? Am I as terrible in person as I was in the app? I laughed, shaking my head. Surprisingly, no. You're actually not terrible at all. Well, that's a relief, he said, his grin widening. Then, after a beat, he added, what do you say we do this again? Maybe dinner next time? I hesitated for a moment, the old wound still fresh in my mind. But then I looked at him, really looked at him. This wasn't the same Jake I had known in college. We weren't the same people anymore. Maybe that was a good thing. I like that, I said finally, feeling a smile tug at the corners of my mouth. He smiled back, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this wasn't just a chance encounter. Maybe it was something more, something worth exploring. We stood up, and as we walked out of the cafe together, I realized that sometimes life has a funny way of bringing people back into your life when you least expect it. Maybe Jake and I had unfinished business, or maybe this was just a chance to rewrite our story. Either way, I was curious to see where it would lead. I wasn't even supposed to be on the app that night. It was late, and I had promised myself I'd spend the evening reading or doing something productive. But of course, that's not how things went. I ended up on my couch, scrolling through profiles on the dating app that had become my guilty pleasure over the past few months. After several disastrous dates and more than a few cringeworthy encounters, I had all but given up on meeting someone special through swiping. It was just a habit now, something to pass the time when I was bored or restless. But as I mindlessly swiped left, rejecting profile after profile, I suddenly stopped. Ethan, 28. The first thing that caught my attention was his photo, a candid shot of him sitting on a park bench laughing at something out of frame. His smile was infectious, and I could almost hear the laugh behind it. It wasn't the usual gym selfie or overly filtered picture you'd expect. It was real. His profile bio was simple but enough to intrigue me. Looking for something genuine. I like live music, midnight snacks, and pretending to know about wine. It was so refreshingly unpretentious that I couldn't help but swipe right. A second later, the familiar message popped up. It's a match. My heart did a tiny flip, the kind it hadn't done in a while. Normally, I wouldn't get too excited about a match, but something about Ethan's profile made me feel hopeful. I figured I'd leave it alone, let him message first. But just as I was about to put my phone down, a message came through. Ethan, so tell me, do you actually know anything about wine? Or are we both just faking it? I laughed out loud, already feeling a little more at ease. I responded quickly. Me. I can tell a red from a white, but that's about as far as my knowledge goes. You? Ethan. I just pretend to know things so I look sophisticated in front of the waiter. His sense of humor was perfect, and from there the conversation flowed easily. We talked about everything from music to travel to the most embarrassing thing that had ever happened to us on a date. I felt like I was talking to an old friend rather than a stranger I had just met online. After about an hour of messaging, Ethan asked if I'd like to meet up sometime. Normally, I'd hesitate after just one night of chatting, but there was something about him that made me say yes without a second thought. We decided to meet up at a little wine bar downtown the following weekend. It was cozy, intimate, and seemed like the perfect spot for our first date. I arrived early, nerves buzzing in my stomach, unsure if the connection we had over text would translate in person. As soon as I walked in, I spotted him at a table near the back, exactly as I'd imagined him. Casual, with a confident but relaxed vibe. He looked up from his menu and smiled when he saw me. That same smile that had drawn me to his profile in the first place. The moment I sat down, all my nerves seemed to evaporate. "Hey," he said warmly, standing up to greet me. We did the awkward first date hug, which actually wasn't awkward at all. It felt easy, comfortable. The conversation flowed just as smoothly in person as it had online. Ethan was charming, funny, and had this effortless way of making me feel like I was the only person in the room. We talked about everything, the best concerts we'd ever been to, weird food combinations we secretly loved, and even our worst dating app horror stories. At one point we were laughing so hard the people at the table next to us glanced over, probably thinking we were a little too loud for the quiet wine bar. After we finished our drinks, neither of us was ready for the date to end. Ethan suggested we take a walk around the city, and I agreed. We strolled through the streets, talking and laughing as we made our way toward a small park. It was a crisp, clear night, and the city seemed quieter than usual, almost serene. When we reached the park, we sat down on a bench, looking up at the stars, and that's when things took a turn. The conversation shifted, becoming a little more serious. "You know," Ethan said, staring up at the sky, "I didn't expect to meet someone like you on a dating app." I smiled. "I could say the same about you." He looked at me, and there was something in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. A depth, maybe even a sadness, that hadn't been there earlier in the evening. "There's something I need to tell you," he said softly. My heart skipped a beat. The words, "I need to tell you something" on a first date are never a good sign. My mind immediately started racing. Was he married? Was he hiding some dark secret? I nodded, bracing myself for whatever was coming. Ethan hesitated, his eyes flicking back up to the stars for a moment before he spoke again. "This is going to sound crazy, and you might not believe me, but I need to say it." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Okay, what is it?" He took a deep breath. "I don't have a lot of time left." I blinked, confusion washing over me. "What do you mean?" Ethan looked down at his hands, his expression somber. "I mean, I'm not supposed to be here. I only get one night and then I disappear." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. Disappear? What are you talking about? He met my eyes and I could see he was serious. "I've been dead for 2 years. My body went cold. I felt a wave of disbelief crash over me, followed by a sickening sense of dread. This had to be a joke, a weird, dark joke, but the look on his face told me it wasn't. I know how it sounds, he continued, but it's the truth. I died in an accident 2 years ago, and every year on the anniversary of my death, I get one night to come back. I stared at him, my heart pounding. What do you mean, come back? How is that even possible? I don't know, he said, his voice almost a whisper. I don't know how or why it happens, but it does. Every year, on this night, I'm here. I'm real for a little while, and then by sunrise, I'm gone. I shook my head, feeling a strange mix of fear and disbelief. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. You're joking, right? This is some kind of... I'm not joking, he said, cutting me off. I wish I were. I felt my throat tighten, and suddenly, everything about the night felt different. The quiet of the streets, the stillness of the park. It all seemed otherworldly now, like I had stepped into some kind of alternate reality. I wanted to tell you sooner, Ethan said, his voice breaking a little. But I didn't want to scare you off. I didn't want the night to end like this. I was silent for a long time, trying to wrap my head around what he was saying. It sounded impossible, like something out of a movie. But as I looked at him, I realized I believed him. I don't know why, but I did. So, what happens now? I asked quietly. Ethan sighed. I'll disappear. And then, I don't know. I'll wait until next year, I guess. I felt a lump form in my throat. And what happens if I want to see you again? If I don't want this to be the last time? Ethan smiled sadly. I don't know if that's possible. We sat there in silence for a long time, neither of us knowing what to say. The night was slipping away, and with it, Ethan's time. As we watched the first light of dawn start to creep over the horizon, I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness. Here was someone I had connected with in a way I hadn't expected, someone who I could have seen myself building something real with. And he wasn't even real, at least not in the way I had thought. When the sky began to lighten, Ethan stood up, looking out at the horizon. It's time, he said softly. I stood up too, my heart aching. Will I ever see you again? He smiled at me, that same warm, infectious smile from his profile photo. Maybe. Next year. Same time. If you're still looking for me. And then, just like that, he turned and started walking away. I watched him disappear into the soft morning light, his figure fading until he was gone. I stayed in the park for a while after that, letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. It felt surreal, like I had stepped out of one world and into another for just one night. And now I was back, alone, wondering if it had all been a dream. But as I looked down at my phone, at the empty chat where Ethan's profile had been, I knew it wasn't.